Hello, everybody. Welcome to International Podcast Day 2020. We are really excited to be bringing another 24-hour live broadcast featuring 60 podcasters from 26 different countries. For this broadcast, we are welcoming Norm Chella from Malaysia. Norm, how are you doing tonight?
Doing good. How about you?
Hey, doing well. Well, I appreciate you coming in. This is the first time we've featured a podcaster from Malaysia, and you're going to be talking about mapping out Asia's podcasting ecosystem, which we're really looking forward to sharing. But first, before I turn it over to you, Norm, I wanted to thank our podcasters, our sponsors as part of International Podcast Day. You can head over to internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors. You can find everybody from Blueberry to Focusrite to Podient to even our celebration supporters. There's some promo codes. There's some cool things that our sponsors are offering up this year. Without their support, and of course, without the support of our 60 podcasters, International Podcast Day would not be what it is today. So, Norm, we're really looking forward to what you have to share. We appreciate you volunteering your time, your energies, and your message about mapping out Asia's podcasting ecosystem.
Sure. Right. So let's get right into it. You might notice that I am looking this way a lot because I tend to have multiple monitors when doing keynotes talking about Asia's podcasting ecosystem. Because when we want to talk about Asia's podcasting ecosystem, the very first question that comes up to mind is, what is Asia's podcasting ecosystem? It's kind of hard. It's very hard to define. Geographically speaking, we have, Southeast Asia, East Asia, South Asia, and spreading out, we have APAC. So that includes Australia, New Zealand, etc. So we have quite a number of countries that encompass the entirety of the Asian podcast ecosystem. And in the pursuit of trying to answer that question, I built a show called Podlovers Asia, which is a show that covers anything and everything related to the podcasting industry in this part of the world, interviewing hosts, producers, and thought leaders in the space, not only from Asian countries, but also those involved in it. So even companies trying to tap into the market, as well as reporters, independent producers, etc. They want to also know what is in this interesting ecosystem that is always thriving, always adapting to its relevant cultural contexts. And in the pursuit of trying to answer that question, once again, I built that show because I myself was confused. So let's do a little bit of time travel. A few years ago, I wanted to know about what is happening in Asia in terms of podcasting, and reading up a lot of news and or sources to find out more about what is happening in the podcast industry in general. It tends to be very Western centric. We tend to look at the US, the UK, Australia, etc. for news, for updates, for metrics, insights, and standards of podcasting, as well as expectations as to what is considered a high quality podcast. We have big names like NPR, Gimlet, Wondery, etc. These set the standards. So can these be replicated in an Asian context? I never knew the answer to that question. So in the pursuit of trying to find out shows locally, I'm based in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. I wanted to see if we can achieve an NPR or Gimlet or Wondery in Asia. So a few years ago, I started freelance in the podcast industry in terms of like writing show notes and producing shows, etc. And I got the chance to collaborate with a team to create Asia's first ever podcast virtual summit, namely called the Asia Podcast Summit, a very original name, also for SEO wise, that's, plus points. And that was a pretty interesting experience because the team built that virtual summit to fill the void of what is happening around here. Who are the leaders? It became very difficult to find out and create a database of who is capable of talking about India's podcasting industry, or the podcasting industry in the Philippines or in Indonesia or in Singapore. So we built a virtual summit to reach out to these experts to talk about their perspective on what is happening in podcasting. So due to that, we got sponsorships from people like Voxnest, Audio-Technica, Google, etc. And we had even an offline event, which was pretty fantastic. I loved it. And in that moment or in that opportunity, I was in this very interesting crossroads where I knew more than the average person about podcasting in Southeast Asia. And I had access to all of these experts because I was part of the team to actually set up the summit. And I was just so curious about what is happening in other countries, those around me, not just the US, the UK, Australia, but like here, like in Malaysia, in Indonesia, or Philippines. So I built the show. I built a show called Podlovers Asia with a picture of a chicken as the logo, a chicken wearing headphones, because nothing stands out more than an animal wearing headphones to listen to podcasts. And from there, the conversations flowed. And 2 years in, we are starting up season 3 now. So season 2 ended quite a few months ago. And season 3 is starting up with more and more conversations with people who are going through, or rather who are on their journey in podcasting from an Asian perspective. And by Asia, I mean Asian and an Asian American perspective as well. So inclusive globally, all around the world. So part of trying to map out Asia's podcasting ecosystem is learning how to tap into the market in the first place. So here are some of my findings. I have talked about these in a previous keynote before, so there is some overlap, but I would rather set the precedence, or I would rather set the foundation equally for everybody who is listening to this right now, that the Asian podcast market is fundamentally different from other monolithic, monolingual markets out there. So if you want to tap into the Asian podcasting market, you have to know what works, what doesn't. How do podcast listeners in Asian countries get their shows? What topics should you avoid as a podcaster? Do you have to worry about censorship? Do you have to worry about, taboo things, or like even on the topics of religion, etc.? These are examples of the factors that make up an Asian podcast market. So before we dive into what's specifically Asian, I define a podcast market into 2 parts, or I would rather divide it into 2 parts. The first is technical data. So technical data consists of the numbers like country listenership rates, audio consumption, salary rates for producers, revenue gain from podcasts as a marketing channel, revenue gain from podcasts in terms of advertising per region, per country. These give us a practical outlook on whether or not a market is viable and sustainable and on the rise. So these numbers are really important for companies, independents who are trying to make a career out of diving into podcasting, etc. The second one is community. So community is when we have the social interactions between listeners as well as creators. So there are a number of discussions, Facebook groups, aggregators, and companies talking to each other within the industry, or companies making buzz within the industry. All of these add up to answering the question from the point of view of someone curious, as if that question was, what is the Asian podcast industry? Like, who's talking about it, etc. So a combination of these two will give you a very healthy, mature market. You can see all of these everywhere around the globe. But what about Asia? You can't really call it as one market, which is when we have to talk about the definition of Asia later on. And Asia consists of many countries, cultures, subcultures, languages, and different levels of technological development. And to call it one market is inaccurate. Many markets here, relative to current stable mature markets, are at infancy stage, but they are on the rise, and with that comes opportunities. There is a third aspect needed to define a podcast market in general, and I call these market specifics. So these are points of interest that make a market or a country or a nation's podcast industry unique in terms of culture, regulation, and many other factors. So if we look at the macro first, some of these Asian markets have very common, shall we say, market-specific points of interest. The first example is that it is majority Android. So according to global stats, over 80% of the penetration rate of mobile phones in Asian markets, or Asian countries rather, is by Android phones. Compare that to Apple mobile devices comprising just over 15%. So the question for anyone trying to understand the market is, how do you tap into a market where a majority of potential users use Android devices? As much as listeners would tap into the podcasting space via their favorite podcast listening app, we know that some podcast listening apps are only on iOS, or some are only on Android, or some are just, you just can't access it, right? So a lot of podcasters would fix, or would only share their subscribe button as listen to us on Apple Podcasts, because that is essentially the norm or the standard of call to actions done by podcasters all around the globe. And we expect that to be the same here in Asia, but it doesn't always translate to success. Some people just don't have Apple devices. Another one is standards of success. So the global standard of what a successful podcast can be doesn't necessarily translate to the same in Asian countries. So some examples include the Leaders of Learning podcast here in Singapore and Malaysia is a top-ranking podcast with over 400,000 downloads in over 2 years. And on the other hand, India's Indian Noir podcast is a critically acclaimed crime and horror fiction podcast with amazing reviews and loyal listeners across India as well as the rest of the world. So that's an example of growth success. Monetary wise, we've had reports of Philippines. We have podcasts with just about $5,000 a month in revenue from advertising, etc. And there was a case study of a podcast based in Japan that has reached up to $8,000 a month in revenue, although these are outliers. These are outliers. I do have to mention that. So in Asian countries, success is defined on a spectrum as opposed to a definition. I would say, or at least from my observations, a lot of podcasters would seem or would look at the success of their show as 5,000 unique downloads per episode leads you to be viable for advertising by other companies. And you can see this is quite, shall we say, prevalent in a lot of hosting platforms, because then they will only consider you to be, oh, you are a marketable podcast, or your listenership is large enough that we may consider you for advertising, or we may consider you for ad slots, etc. But there's a disconnection there, because how do we get 5,000 unique listens per episode when a lot of companies, especially in Asia, want to tap into Asian consumers or Asian markets? How do we know that those 5,000 listens translate to the specific markets that they are interested in? Are these numbers relevant to them? And furthermore, when the markets are infancy stage or when the markets are on the rise, it will be very difficult to reach 5,000 listens per episode for a lot of Asian podcasts. So a lot of podcasters would think that their shows are not doing as good because they're not reaching that sweet 3-4 digit listen metrics. And that brings up a point where success is now defined on a spectrum, right? You need a critical mass of listeners to be considered successful or monetizable, but that may not be the same in Asia. Now, there are exceptions, of course, just like every other market, and there are outliers, but there are exceptions. And one of those is listenership rates. So listenership rates vary across the entirety of the Asian continent. In India, end of 2019, 40 million of India's nearly 500 million internet users listen to podcasts. So that's 40 million, the 40 million podcast listeners. Compare that to 2018, there was a 60% growth in podcast listeners. So the rate at which India is growing is just amazing. It's fantastic. Like, I really recommend following the Indian podcasting scene because it's just fascinating how fast they are growing. If we go to East Asia, the highest listenership rate in the world is in South Korea with 58%. It's a country with a strong radio culture and a very interesting business acumen. So they've been podcasting since 2005. And after discovering, the growth of podcasting as a technology in 2004 and 2005, they brought it back to South Korea and they started building that amazing downloadable audio culture that has been growing over time. In contrast, China has a $7 billion audio market. Although there's a caveat to that number, even though it's $7 billion, it's not just podcasts, but it includes other audio educational content. So the way that they would frame audio content in China is a bit different. It's more of an umbrella of audio educational content as opposed to any kind of show that is on an RSS feed. So these are countries with a very strong podcast culture in Asia, and at least they are, they contain a large number of listeners that if you are a business or if you're an independent trying to tap into there, it might be worth looking into that. Now, this is another thing that I have also noticed is that a lot of these numbers are, of course, they are measured, so it's fine to gauge from there just how big the market is. But coverage of listener metrics in other languages is still a bit of an issue. So multilingual listenership is a rising market specific. Though there is a prominent English-speaking audience listening to English language shows, both locally and from around the world, even though we are in Asian markets, there are English language shows and podcasts growing here, of course. There's a rapid rise in context-specific shows. So podcasts in local languages that cater to immediate audiences. So in Hindi, in Telugu, in Tagalog, in Bahasa Indonesia, in Bahasa Malaysia, in Mandarin or in Cantonese. And I know that we've passed the 1 million mark on total podcasts globally, but I think the numbers I've checked last time, it's like 1.4 now. Asian podcasters, at least the guests that I've had on my show, Podlovers Asia, have mentioned that English language shows done by Asian podcasters are the first movers within Asian podcasting. And a lot of them think that we are only in the first wave, but once more and more non-English Asian shows pop up, they will make the bulk of the next, say, million or even 2 million podcasts, or at least the majority of the next group of Asian podcasts that will be published online. I personally also share that sentiment, especially because we lack quite a bit of guidance in terms of trying to start a show or trying to set expectations as to whether or not a podcast is a viable way of content creation, not even just as a hobby, but as a business thing or as a project, etc. It's just not as popular within the realm of content creators within Asia, since there are other mediums that we have to compete with, like vlogging or YouTubing, etc. Another market specific that can vary across many Asian markets is the censorship or the sensitivity of topics. I don't want to say censorship because that can be a little bit too aggressive, although it does happen. If you talk about political issues and topics that may not be so widely talked about in public, maybe concerning government figures, etc., these have a degree of sensitivity. There are cases of shows being under fire for inappropriate comments on powerful political figures. I don't want to highlight a show that did this year, but it did happen, and they had to issue a formal apology. The interesting thing about that is, although this happened in Singapore, the interesting thing about that is a lot of the podcasters who have heard of that news would celebrate, not because something bad happened, but because the news were actually, they started talking about podcasting. So it's like a huzzah for, podcasting in this part of the world. And there were rumors of episodes being labeled as explicit to have less visibility in Asian countries, although this has been disproved. I'm not sure if it's due to the fear or the uncertainty that explicit episodes therefore equals less visibility, or that people just aren't so confident about having more and more explicit shows. They would rather play it safe. I think that starts to tie in with cultural nuances that we have to consider when we want to tap into the market as a creator. So these are some examples of podcast market specifics within Asia. And if you want to tap into it as either a listener or a podcaster or a business, you have to worry about what to watch out for. Who do you talk to? And how can you help? If you want to tap into it as a podcaster, I would highly recommend that the way that you market your show to cater for web app and Android listeners to access your show. Either have a really strong Podchaser page as your main landing page, or even better yet, have your own domain to have your own website to host everything under there. A great start here page to get people straight to your shows on their favorite podcast listening app, with 80% of users being Android. cater for a lot of the apps that work really, really well on Android. You can even do like a chartable link, and then you just have a smart link that can connect to every single app that they can access to, a couple of taps, and then you can move straight to your podcast listening app, making your listeners go through a seamless experience when wanting to subscribe to your show is vastly important. And even more so when we have such a huge disparity in terms of potential podcast listeners and regular podcast listeners, which I will bring up later on after this. Another point is for a podcaster, if you want to tap into it, is that collaborations are key. Like I said, Asian podcast ecosystem is not as defined. It's not one color. I would say that it runs deeper than just calling it Asia market. So if you want to tap into many different regions that make up the entirety of the Asian podcast market, I highly recommend that you collaborate and or connect with other podcasters in these regions, in these countries that you want to tap into, and create win-win situations between hosts and producers, and as well as the audiences, so you can tap into each other's audiences and grow the market as a whole. For some podcasters, I noticed that they work really well when they go really, really niche and focus on a high quality filtered audience. So before you start a show, or before you define it, or before you create an episode that you want to cater to a specific market or a specific country, making sure what that audience is beforehand is probably a very good indicator of, okay, maybe I can tap into them more. So there are shows like one called Two Book Nerds Talking, discussing literature, in particular Asian literature, led by two Malaysian hosts. And they're quite popular here in Kuala Lumpur, leading to offline events and even talks with famous authors. And that works really well in these cultural contexts, because these local hosts talking about Asian literature, catering for an Asian podcast listening audience, since they have built the show off of a Facebook group that they manage, has led to an amazing feedback loop where these listeners are not just listeners. They don't just become passive. They have converted from passive listeners to active fans that become part of the discussion when talking about literature, when talking about book discussions, when talking about comments made by the hosts that are inside jokes, right? So huge amount of success there. I'm not saying that they may have 5,000 downloads or anything like that, but their level of success, once again, is defined differently, and therefore they are thriving well. Another point for a podcaster is to consider Omni-Channel Analytics, and that is extremely related to what I've just mentioned before, the metrics that matter beyond listenership. So what is your mailing list? What is your average open rate? What is your business leads? How many members are in your Facebook group? How many comments and replies and shares are you getting on the page that is related to your podcast? So these aren't exactly listens, but these are still social interactions, right? These are just interactions on a different platform. They're not exactly listening, but they're engaging. And engagement is what we want. Like, engagement is the most powerful metric for any podcaster, and that doesn't have to be 5,000 listens an episode. In Asia, it can vary. It really depends on how you are trying to capture and talk to and befriend your listeners and put them in the community where they can belong, and therefore they become ambassadors for your podcast shows. So you prioritize less on listens and downloads and more on the journey for the listener. And if you zoom this out for a little bit, for B2B podcasts, does it lead to a business lead? Does it lead to a sales call? Like 1,000 listens with a 6-figure sale within one of them, like one of the leads is warm, it's much better than 10,000 listens and no revenue from there as a result. So think of success even before you consider tapping into these markets. And on another note, related to Omni-Channel Analytics, of course, there are upcoming, shall we say, measurement analytics platforms, which I will probably put in the chat to this, where they are considering this. They've noticed that these analytics go beyond standard podcast listening metrics are much more important, and then now they encompass that as part of your entire stack of podcast engagement analytics or Omni-Channel Analytics. I think it's called podmetrics.co. So I will probably put that in the chat somewhere right below. It's perfectly fine. And yeah, as a business, if you want to tap into this market, it is pretty gray. Each country has its own nuances, issues, etc. Map out who are the key players in each podcasting space. Who's talking the most about podcasting from these countries? Who leads the Facebook groups? Who leads the Twitter accounts that engage with Asian podcast listeners? Who is always consistently pouring out publishing episodes? Who are the independent reporters that talk about, say, India's podcasting scene or Malaysia's podcasting scene? I found one publication recently that is pretty fantastic. They've been covering the Indian podcasting scene called podcasthub.in. So the Podcast Hub independent reporter who is covering India's podcasting industry. Pretty fascinating. These articles are I love reading them. So I really do appreciate that there are others who are so curious that they are willing to write about it. These are the experts. These are the ones who are on the field trying to map it out just as much as you are, except that they are there. They have the advantage of knowing the right people and they are writing about it, or they are reaching out to people with these conversations, or they are trying to create these conversations rather to get a better understanding of what is happening around them. So you map this out and you get to know them and you see what they need. Figure out how maybe your product or your network or your proximity can help with their demands, and you can capture them as either potential leads or just make them part of your network, because collaborations, once again, are key. And if you want to grow this market to make it viable for your business, then might as well be friends with those who are already in it. Works for everybody. Another point as a business is to go with a bottom-up approach. So if you get into the nitty-gritty of this, shift your KPIs to be a lot more long-form and relationship-based. Podcasters, or local podcasters rather, would prefer partnerships than, immediate cold sales calls or immediate cold sales emails to hear about your amazing product without them knowing who you are. It will just seem like spam. So if you could initiate partnerships with local podcasters to understand their problems, needs, and how you can help them, then by proxy, you can become associated with their show because you're such a big fan of them or you're such a big supporter of them. And listeners will naturally look at your company brand as one part of their local regional podcasting industry. And I came to this realization recently when I was looking at events hosted by the O2 Pod Collective, which is a group of amazing podcasters based in India, in Bangalore, I believe. Shout outs to Naga of Passion People Podcast as one of the members to be leading that. A lot of their events are hosted there, and they are sponsored by Hindenburg. So people would associate Hindenburg with podcasting in India. So they would look at Hindenburg as the sole, shall we say, DAW or the sole software to edit one's podcast. So that's an example of them injecting funds into the community or supporting up the market. And then by proxy, they may get second order effects like potential leads from them being a sponsor for these events of these specific market-specific events and opportunities. It's pretty fantastic. I love it. Now, some key players I would love to give a shout out to and or to inform you of these up and coming players, because they are going to be part of the wave of Asian podcasters and or companies that will make up a standard definition of success that is very unique to Asians. So one company I include Waves. It's a Vietnamese podcast network and production company. They've acquired seed funding and they're furthering their expansion into Indonesia. So amazing team. I really like what they're doing. Podmetrics is what I mentioned before, an upcoming analytics company. They've just got funding from Splice Media, which is another media transformation company. They cover the transformation of digital media in Asia. So Podmetrics applied for funding from them, or a grant rather, and now they're providing podcasters with metrics from beyond listens and downloads and more. Podcast network companies specifically, Puma Podcasts is a podcast network from the Philippines with leading reporters, producers, and like multiple shows under their name on current events, news, and governance. They've just released an interesting, shall we say, a focus group discussion talking about podcasting within the Philippines, and there's going to be a conversation with them soon, so I'm reaching out to them about that. So I'm curious to see what they will bring up when it comes to what is happening in the podcasting industry in the Philippines. A lot of companies would look at the Philippines as one way to tap into the Asian podcast market, or the Southeast Asian podcast market as a whole, since the Philippines is a majority English-speaking language country. Yes, there is Tagalog, although they noticed that a lot of the listeners for podcasts are in English, and they speak amazing English, so that, it's just natural common sense for a company to start tapping into the Philippines that way. Renegade Radio from Malaysia is a growing podcast network, and they're trying to be the Gimlet of Asia, which is a pretty ambitious mission and ambitious goal. I do support them for that. On the rise with multiple shows under their belt already, and that is extremely inspiring to hear. There are other companies as well, like IVM Podcasts, which I'm a big fan of. I really like what they're doing there. Awaz as well. So these two companies are from India, and IVM covers. I listen to more IVM podcasts more because they speak in English, and Awaz covers non-English languages, since in India there are multiple languages that they want to create shows for. So Awaz does it really well right there. So as a listener, if you want to support your local shows, just talk about their shows, sharing their episodes in social media, and just share what you think about them. That's like the biggest thing that we need. And this is prevalent in not only in Asia, but in most places around the world. Discoverability and exposure for podcasters is very, very difficult. And the more that we talk about these things, like the more that we talk about these shows, the greater the numbers go. But a lot of podcasters would go into the foray of creating content, the world of creating content through podcasting, but then they have to translate their marketing to other formats like social media marketing, to videos, to blog posts, etc. And as podcasters, we work best behind the mic. So it'll be very hard for us to context switch and then start marketing things. So we do fall a little bit behind when it comes to marketing our shows. So as a listener, if you notice that, just share, like, and comment, and even give words of encouragement, because really, even if you're a listener of a show, your voice really, really matters. Like, I don't know how many times I've had a few comments and emails come up to me because I've started Podlovers Asia to say thank you for giving a place for Asian voices to come out and voice about their shows, or to talk about what they're doing, or to talk about what is happening in the podcasting scene there in either India or in Philippines or in Singapore or even in Japan or in China. So really, as a listener, your voice really matters. Also, it's best to recommend guests because people love getting guests recommended to them. Another point as a listener, to join communities, because groups and all of those that focus on podcasts in these countries are still in their infancy stage. They are not in the thousands in terms of their members, and they are not exactly as thriving in terms of wanting to push forward the medium of podcasting more, mainly because of scale. So if you being a member in there helps them, then I'm sure that your participation and your voice and your willingness to add value back into the conversation would help them a lot. So some examples include Podcast SG, which is for Singapore, Malaysian Podcasters Community, which is for Malaysia, and the Podcast Collective, which is more on Southeast Asia and more. And once again, shout outs to O2 Pod Collective, which is based in Bangalore, once again, because they are thriving in terms of what they are doing. I think, if I remember correctly, they had an event and there were up to like 70 members who attended to hear about how to start a podcast, etc. So it's a community that is thriving and on the rise. So if you want to keep up to date there, I highly recommend that you I highly recommend that you follow these groups, because they are working hard in building podcasting as the norm or the standard of articulating a conversation or a message or a narrative within their respective countries. So if you're wondering about the future of Asian podcasting market, I have a few thoughts in my head that have been circling around before this conversation, or before this talk rather. It is on the rise, and there are more and more listeners as well as creators. And as mentioned before, there's going to be a prediction that a majority of the next million shows will be non-English, at least. So this also includes, European languages, Spanish, French, etc. But Asian languages are also up there. It's just a matter of teaching a lot of potential creators in non-English languages that podcasting is also another way to bring out your mission, show your principles, or talk about what you want to talk about, etc. So the question then becomes, what percentage of the next million will be in Asian languages is another story altogether. So as we are thinking about all of this, how do we tap into the Asian podcasting scene? And how do we accommodate for a variety of multilingual podcast listeners, each with their own cultural context and their own nuances? And from there, as someone that is as someone who is shall we say, a citizen of digital society, when you see these amazing shows, how can you help Asian podcasters with growing their shows and at the same time tackle the Asian podcast markets? So, right. So that's normally that's the gist of what Asian podcasting can be, or what it is and what is observed. And I mainly wanted to add that as a foundation right now, because we are having a bit of trouble trying to define what is Asian podcasting. And I understand. Normally it's because podcasting has always been so Western that we assume that to be the standard, or we assume that to be the expectation of what is a high quality show. But the amount of resources to achieve that level, say here or somewhere else, is very difficult. And there are other things like regulation and viability as a career and more that stop us from trying to define what Asian podcasting really is. And this is when I can get a little bit this is less on metrics and observations, and this is more on my thoughts. But I would think that Asian podcasting is more on the acceptance of diversity in culture, because from there we have the acceptance of diversity in voices. In a lot of podcasts that are built or that are produced overseas, we talk a lot about setting the level of professionalism, edit, making sure that the conversations are concise, take away all the filler words, take away the ums and the ahs, fix the guests in terms of pronunciation, in terms of grammar, and more. But that, I don't want to say that takes away the soul of the guest or the soul of the episode, but that reduces the chance for a listener to immerse into country-specific episodes. This is coming from someone who has been editing these episodes for Podlovers Asia. Each episode takes you to a different country, right? Like we have one Singapore, and then all of a sudden you go to India, and then all of a sudden you go to Philippines, and then suddenly Vietnam. In Vietnam or in Thailand, you can hear the sound of tuk-tuks. And India, you can hear the sounds of something else, right? And in Malaysia, it could be something completely different. And it might even be mixed languages, because in Malaysia, we have Rojak, and Rojak is a mix of multiple languages to make up a conversation. How do you articulate that in a podcast? And that is when we have to think about diversity in culture, because Rojak, or mixed languages, is now accepted for Malaysian podcast listeners. It may alienate a bit to a certain extent listeners from all around the world, but still, it is evidence of a country's non-monolithic culture. I mean, taking Malaysia, for example, Malaysia is a multilingual culture. There are many subcultures, many religions are prevalent there, and many traditions that make up the entirety of one country that is Malaysia. It's the same for Singapore, it's the same for India and Philippines and Thailand and Vietnam. There are many, right? So they have different standards or different perspectives when it comes to these languages. We then have to worry about when we are talking about these shows in English language. Are we talking to them in English, or are we using English as a tool for communicating their context in their language? In the pursuit of trying to answer that question, I came to realize that a lot of shows here they over-edit too much because they cater to the expectations of what a perfect English language conversation can be, as seen in the US. But here, all of these stutterings, all these ums and ahs, these accents, they add so much more to what is considered an Asian voice. English is just to communicate best with the guest. It's the intermediary, and that's important. Like, that distinction is very, very important. We're not just speaking in English. We are using English to speak in their language. That is the mission behind Podlovers Asia for me. And that is my intention behind trying to tap into these markets where people are thriving in different languages, and I have absolutely no idea what they're talking about, yet I still want to know what is happening. And really, these expectations that we bring in from podcasting markets globally, I feel that we have to have a distinction between what is success here and therefore what is an Asian voice here than what is success outside. So yeah, that really is pretty much it to make sure that that Asian podcasting, the definition of it is still extremely Asia specific and not necessarily in the realm of an English language conversation that just talks about Asia. We can then forgive each other for having, say, poor language efficiency, or we can forgive each other for having or taking our time with trying to understand what they are saying, or we can forgive them for having trouble trying to translate in their head what they're trying to say into English because it's not their first language. I would like to advocate, honestly, for, shall we say, the flaws and the struggles of articulating each other in English, because we need to recognize that there are other languages out there, and therefore there are other podcast shows out there. So if you are a listener, or if you're a producer, or if you're an independent podcaster that wants to hear more of Asian voices and wants to create shows that are based off of an Asian voice, right? A culturally specific voice, go for it. Limit your editing and maintain a unique, high quality narrative and or story that is unique to the show, not to pander or not to be compared with other successful shows out there. Because we listen to these shows to enjoy, to entertain ourselves, but in terms of trying to create something, we need to create from the single source of truth, and that is us, Asian podcasters, or Asian podcast creators, rather. So on a mission to try to grow that, that's what Podlovers Asia is trying to do, tapping into the conversations between people, these different countries, these different metrics, these different markets, and the podcasters that survive there and thrive there and struggle there and try to find their own unique voice there, even though they already have a unique voice. They just struggle when being compared to the successes of other shows that just have a very commonly used Western voice. So I really do want to advocate for that. And I hope that if you want to tap into the Asian podcasting market, or if you want to get a better understanding of Asia's podcast ecosystem, really be open-minded. Ask out on Twitter, in public, what are some Asian podcast shows you would love to listen to? What are some genres and I really do appreciate that. Some little fun things that I would like to end this on is that recently Pod News has started this interesting page, which of course I will just read it out loud. It's podnews.net/article/Spotify. And they have listed out this very interesting page where you can look at the top listened shows in the summer of 2020 on Spotify. When this page came out, it showed the top 100 shows, and now it got brought down to 10. I found it really fascinating just reading through these, and you can also find the listened shows on other countries as well, so if you're interested in. But just to highlight on the Asian countries themselves, I find it really fascinating just how different how different the shows are when they're ranked in top 10 by people in different countries, even though the countries are just neighboring each other. So if I remember correctly, a lot of the Indonesian top 10 shows are horror based. In Malaysia and in Singapore, a lot of them are very conversational based. They tend to be a lot of influencers or a lot of those who are already pretty prevalent. There are celebrities already on YouTube, etc., and they have a podcast element, and therefore they listen to it there. And there are some other parts as well I would rather not show because some of these shows can be a little bit explicit, so I'd rather not show it as this is a family-friendly stream. But it just goes to show, even if you're not looking for these numbers, even if you're not looking for these metrics, look at those top 10 shows for each and every country in Asia. They are different. They are actually different. And they are different in language. They are different in culture. They are different in topic specificity. And that means that when you want to create something that will rank top 10 Spotify, or that will rank top 100 or whatever, you need to be able to create something that listeners within that country will want to listen to, even though that is common sense, will want to listen to, and that is not limited to just talking about your thoughts on that country or your thoughts on an issue within that country. Go a little bit deeper. Find ways to show that you have put effort in immersing yourself in that country, maybe through conversations with someone within said context. To give you an example, in season 2, I barely knew anything about India's podcasting industry. Even if I had access to the experts that were brought up during the Asia Podcast Summit, I still didn't know enough. There are only a few sources of numbers in terms of podcast listeners. So instead of trying to make something up or just give my thoughts, I would rather just go right into the field and talk to someone who is actually very active in India's podcasting industry. So 2 people came to mind at the time: Nikesh Murali of Indian Noir and Naga of Passion People Podcast. These are 2 people that are extremely active, and they're always up there talking about podcasting in general from an Indian perspective. And that is completely new to me. Being open and being open-minded with that, and having the ability to satisfy one's curiosity about a different market by going right up there and talking to them, it tells you much more than, say, looking these numbers up online on Google. So I would honestly recommend that you just talk to more podcasters across Asia. Connect with them. Find out what they need. Find out what they're trying to deal with right now. Find out where can you help them, etc. And in return, you can learn more about Asian podcasting. Because in the end, the word Asian podcasting, or the term rather, it's subjective. My definition of Asian podcasting is very, very different from somebody else's definition of Asian podcasting. It could be podcasting within Southeast Asia, within South Asia, within East Asia, and even more. There's so many different nuances that actually change and affect that, because in Southeast Asia, you also think of India and Bangladesh, but then you can also think about, say, Pakistan, right? To some people, is Pakistan part of Asia? I think it is. But then that brings up the definition of Asia, the word. What is Asian podcasting? Asian podcasting does not have one definition. So it's our job to find out what are all the definitions of Asian podcasting and create content that resonates well with each of these definitions of podcasting. And with each of these definitions of Asian podcasting that you create content for, you will then naturally tap into their relevant Asian podcasting market. And with that, that is pretty much it. More on my journey on Podlovers Asia as I'm starting season 3. I'll be talking to a few people from across, say, China, Singapore, and more in the Asian American podcasting scene. Shout outs to those in the Asian American Podcasters Association. They are fantastic and they are keeping it up with a lot of visibility for Asian creators, which I highly do appreciate. So massive kudos to them for bringing in the diversity for Asian voices within the realm of podcasting. So that is it from me. Podlovers Asia is on Twitter, and you have my website as well, podloversasia.com. I will be doing an overhaul on that website sometime soon, as it will be part of a bigger, large overhauling plan. But other than that, that's it from me.
Norm, I want to thank you for that. There is, I think you raise up a lot of questions within the Asian podcast space, and the definition, how we see and hear their voices. I think there's so much that can be learned when it comes to the data and the trends and everything that you're showing. And I will shadow what you were talking about with the O2 Pod Collective. I believe we had them on last year on our event, and they are fabulous. As you said, building an amazing community. And the fact that you're talking about them here, and just so much information out there is just absolutely incredible. So we appreciate everything that you're doing out there. And I think as we talked offhand or off show, is you just love it. You just dive in. You kind of nerd out about all these things. But we appreciate having your voice in this space. It's absolutely incredible.
Thank you so much. And honestly, like, even if I'm doing this show, even if I'm doing a lot of talks, etc., I will always give a shout out to all of these amazing Asian podcasters and these Asian podcasting groups out there, because they, I feel like they are equal in terms of trying to bring up that overall voice that we are also here. We are also trying to map out this thing. We are also trying to map out this ecosystem ourselves from our own perspectives with our own efforts, but then we are brothers and sisters in that pursuit of trying to map that out. So yeah, massive shout outs to everybody right there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can actually over here on International Podcast Day do a little bit better about providing. I'm glad that your voice is out here. I'm glad you're able to share that. I think we can do more even next year with highlighting what's going on over there. So Norm, I definitely appreciate you joining us and being part of the International Podcast Day broadcast. And of course, we have your website up right there, podloversasia.com. And yeah, make sure you follow Norm, get in touch with them, ask questions. And we'll definitely be in touch, Norm, because you provide a good voice and a good message for our community.
No worries. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, everybody, I appreciate you tuning in to this broadcast of International Podcast Day, and continue to go out there, use the hashtag International Podcast Day, and continue to spread the word. So for now, thank you.